SSUPD SUPD, or is it SSUPD? SUPD? Sup dog? How about souped? Because this is one heck of a souped up case. Welcome to Machines and More. I'll stick to Meshlicious for now to keep everyone happy, but you know, whatever you want to call it, it's here. This is the SSUPD Meshlicious, and right now it's starting to make its way into your hands, which is awesome stuff. Lots of exciting times for SFF. This is going to be the first of quite a few episodes dedicated to this case. Today will be the initial overview and build. And in the following videos to come, I have a few quick mods to show and test. And even though this is primarily a liquid cooler's case, I have a few ideas for air cooling to test. And at some point, this is going all the way to a full-blown custom loop. But what we'll do today is start by validating specs, discussing a few configuration options. And for the initial build, I'll be using an all-in-one liquid cooler. We'll collect some baseline thermal data to compare it with the other IT case, the NR200P. And then I'll share some airflow recommendations for what is going to be this pretty much vanilla build in this case. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button to stay updated on all the videos related to this case. So this one is a very special 14.7 liter case made possible by a partnership between Lee & Lee and the designer also known for the N-Case N1 and Form T1. Welcome to the channel here. It's a sandwich style layout, meaning that your motherboard and your GPU are on opposing sides of one another, but it's not your Dan A4 layout where your I/O end of your motherboard is on the same side as your GPU's I/O. Instead, this one is meant to be used vertically like a tower, with the GPU's I/O on the bottom and the motherboard's I/O on the back of the case. Now, on the opposing side is the only official mounting location for your case and your rad fans. You can have up to two 140mm fans, and you also have mounting holes for two 120mm fans. On the side of the case, you can also run a 240 or a 280mm rad. The total clearance you have here is about 63mm, which means that with 25mm fans, a 35mm rad is the largest reasonable option. The GPU will connect to your ITX motherboard with a riser cable. And depending on which version of this case you get, you may have a PCIe 3.0 or 4.0 cable. The one I have here for review is the 3.0. And honestly, even with the PCIe 4.0 GPUs, you're not missing out on much. Because the I/O for the GPUs on the bottom, there is a cutout for you to get a display cable into here. It did come with a 90-degree HDMI cable, and I will be using that for testing. You can also get 90-degree adapters for both HDMI and DisplayPort and use those there. You also have the option to use a mini or small form factor GPU up to 211mm long if you're not using a radiator. And that does place the I/O end of the card on the same end of the motherboard. But given that this is a case already slanted towards liquid cooling, I'm guessing that's not going to be too popular an option. And with those GPU limitations, it's going to be really hard to put one there anyway. All these panels are toolless, and they snap in with a magnetic-like precision. And actually quite quietly too. On the top, the mesh panel, and there is an iteration with two mesh panels on the side, but this one actually is the one with one glass and one vented panel, and the glass is a little bit tinted, not too dark, but I think just the right amount. Panels are surprisingly hefty for what they look like, and that is good. They're pretty sturdy. Small 1mm round holes for ventilation. The case does measure in at 363mm tall, 245mm deep, and 165mm wide. So the quoted volume is quite accurate, although there is a protrusion at the back of the case for the small form factor GPU that is not accounted for. For a regular graphics card, you can go up to 332mm long, 155mm tall, or I guess in this case it's the width of the card. And in the default configuration, you have up to 3 slots of thickness, which I'm going to estimate at about 60mm to give you a little bit of safety buffer. For your air cooler or AIO CPU block, 73mm is the max. There are a few configuration options that the user can choose. First off, this case does take ATX power supplies under 170mm in length, and SFXL or SFX power supplies work just fine. And if you're using an ATX power supply, then I'd make sure to get the all mesh side panel version Otherwise, it's going to be really tight there on airflow, since it's on one side it's going to be right up against the glass, and on the other up against the GPU. I'd recommend an SFX though, because if you're building in a small form factor case, you're going to want to save that space. For the SFX PSU, you do have a few options to consider if you are planning on using the tempered glass panel. On the motherboard side, there's two possible orientations with the PSU plate in the stock out of the box low position. You'll notice there's two screw hole options. So if you want the fan facing out, it's a good idea to offset it so that there is some space here, about 13 millimeters. And you can also flip the PSU so that the fan faces in. I'd place it as close as possible along the outside of the case, so you get about 28 millimeters of space between the center divider. Now you could also raise the power supply up by flipping the plate, but doing so does eliminate the outermost holes, so you really only have the fan facing out option. There is also an option to shift the entire motherboard tray here 19 millimeters out. This involves unmounting this entire center assembly and swapping the top bar for an included shorter one, and that does allow for a thicker GPU up to 4 slots. Of course, that does take away your clearance above the motherboard to about 53 or 54 millimeters, and many AIO CPU blocks will exceed that restriction, so your mileage may vary on that one. Your choice of card and PSU will also determine your drive capacity, because the only way to get 3.5-inch drives into this case is if you run the small form factor card and use the included drive mounts at the bottom. With the vertical GPU layout, you can have 3 2.5-inch SSDs. 2 can go at the bottom, and another one can fit between the power supply and the GPU, the back of the GPU. For this build, I did consider going with Ryzen 5000, and I probably will towards the later stages. But for this initial setup, I am going to go with the Ryzen 7 3700X because I want a congruent comparison against the NR200P. And with that, I am going to use the ASUS B550 ITX board. There's a very specific reason for this particular board. While it's not my favorite AMD chipset ITX board now, it is one of the few boards that has a USB-C front header, which this case supports. And you also have the option, if you're running an Intel CPU, you can go with a Z490 or Z590 ITX board. And with few exceptions, most of those will have a USB-C front header, except for the lower end ones. The other reason I want this board is for the 10K probe header, because we're going all the way to a custom loop, and this one has a great fan header layout as well, all along the top with the RGB ports here too. So this is perfect for this case, since the cable management location here, there's a slot cut out at the top here. To cool the CPU, we can either go with a 280 or 240 for this case, but I am going to go with a 240 to optimize on space. And for that, I'm going to use the Cooler Master ML240 Illusion. It's a really nice AIO, one of my favorites right now, but I will be swapping out the fans right away for the Noctua NFA 12x25, since that's what the NR200 benchmarks were based off of. But I think it's a good idea anyway. These will be the only 2 fans, and they will be doing double duty as a case and a rad fan, so it wouldn't be a bad idea to upgrade it right away. You can run these at a high minimum RPM without much of a noise penalty. If you're concerned about the looks of the fan, I also have the Arctic P12 RGB on the review desk here. They are a little bit different than the regular P12s, but I will have feedback, and these should be a decent option for those looking for an RGB enabled fan that can still perform quietly. Again, I've yet to bench test these, but they should be pretty decent. For the RAM kit, Team Groove sent by one of their Extreme ARGB kits in white, 16 gigs, 3200 megahertz, which is a good starting point for a Ryzen build. And big thanks to them, and welcome to the channel as well. So as you can see here, the 3070 FE, it's not optimal because of the flow-through design being right up against the back of the motherboard. But it is the card I have right now, and it has been in a lot of case reviews, especially the NR200P. So let's just see how it works out of the box, and then in the next video I'll try a few things to make this card work a lot better. Power supply will be the 850 watt Cooler Master SFX unit. This revised unit will give us a little bit of extra airflow because this fan will be running pretty much all the time. And lastly, the 1 terabyte Crucial M.2 NVMe here. The back of the motherboard is going to be a miserable place for an M.2, so I'm just going to go ahead and recommend to get a big one. Prices on these are pretty reasonable now, so 1 terabyte should be good enough that you don't need the slot in the back. SATA drives are also an option too for now or for future expansion. You just mount them at the bottom of the case, but let's just keep it simple for cabling right now, and let's get building. To start this build, I'm going to mount up the radiator and the cables first, and this will help give us a good idea of where the cables can go. Then I'll pop the power supply into place with the plate oriented this way. We'll offset from the glass a little bit. Then we can work on motherboard, mount up the M.2 drive, the CPU, and the RAM. It's fine to mount the AIO pump head right now too. This one uses a stock backplate, and it's pretty easy. Now, since this PSU is modular, I can connect the cables on the motherboard end first. So just pop the 24-pin ATX and the EPS cable for the CPU on. And you'll notice I haven't actually mounted the board in place yet. I'm going to do something specifically because this one I have is the PCIe 3.0 riser cable version. And so I'm going to lay the board down on a non-conductive surface and just put the graphics card in directly. There's a good reason to do this besides just testing if your system will post for any PCIe 4.0 compatible board. So in other words, X570 and B550 with a Ryzen 3000 or above processor, or Z590, B560, or select Z490 and Intel 11th Gen Rocket Lake. We want to minimize any potential problems by setting the expansion slot to Gen 3 instead of auto. If you don't, potentially you will have to take the board out and do this anyway in case you can't post. Now, I don't have the Gen 4 cable shipping with other Meshlicious kits, but I'd imagine it'd be fine without setting to Gen 4 specifically. So once that's done, I can mount the board. I want to snake the I/O cables underneath the motherboard this way, but you can also zip tie them along the frame and just run them across. Now we can back channel and connect up our cables to the power supply. Go ahead and hook up your GPU cable while you're there. I'll cinch these down with the included zip ties so that they stay organized, and just flip around, pop the card in, connect up the power. You can hook up the fan cables, the RGB, and well, that's all done. Remarkably easy. So here it is, all complete. A few build notes for your reference. You'll notice I took out this top rib when I was building, and that makes it possible to route the tubes of the AIO around the divider, and I would just position the radiator barbs at the top, and then you might have to manage the tubes this way just by curling it around and rotating the pump head. As for the panel placement, if you have one tempered glass panel and one vented panel like this unit I have, the sensible placement is to vent the GPU and close off the motherboard side. It's an AIO on this side anyway, so the glass really doesn't matter. We'll cover the air cooling options separately. For cable management, I've opted to snake the cables along the divider and cinch them down with a zip tie. There's a few anchoring points along the divider, which is really convenient. And lastly, for the power supply, I pretty much had to run the fan facing out because of the length of the 24-pin ATX cable here was not sufficient to do it the other way. And depending on your choice of power supply, you might face a dilemma like that as well. Either way, it will be okay. With an SFX unit, there's a huge air gap open along the PSU towards the back of the case, so some additional air can come in anyway. Just don't put your fan right up against the glass and you should be fine. I am a bit concerned about the back of the motherboard being exposed directly to the heat from the graphics card, especially with this flow-through design. So I think good airflow is key here because these are your only case radiator fans. I would recommend setting your curves so that you have a bare minimum, a floor of 1000 RPM running all the time, if not higher at 1200 RPM, especially with these fans. You won't hear them anyway. and then just ramp up from there, because if you do index your fan speeds against your CPU temps, your motherboard and your GPU might not be getting good airflow simply because at that particular moment, your CPU might not be running hard. Lastly, I'll cover the thermals in just a second, but because I settled on exhaust mode for these fans, I did opt for a fan grill for the fan adjacent to the motherboard just to prevent the cables from getting caught in the fan and rubbing up against the blades. Airflow in this case is really simple due to just two fans. So I tested combined thermals first for both intake and exhaust by running Red Dead 2 on 1440p, and this was running at about 70 to 80 FPS with this graphics card, pretty much full throttle on the card. CPU was locked at 4.3 gigahertz and 1.25 volts, rad fans at 1550 RPM, GPU fans at 50%, so this gives a noise level at about 3 or so decibels above the noise floor. Same test and noise level that I benched the NR200P with, and well, at least for the initial build, you don't really have any great options as you can see here. And either two options are okay, they're viable depending on your priorities, but due to the proximity of your graphics card to your radiator, there's a very strong interdependence between the two components in the combined scenario. For the intake option, you're pushing the hot air right at the card, so it's not great, especially with the flow-through card design here already being suboptimal. This is really bad. And when you flip the fans the other way as the exhaust, the GPU does actually become quite decent, surprisingly. The negative pressure does help the card pull in additional air, but while this is okay for gaming, that's some pretty rough going for the CPU at this point since the rad is actively sucking in all the exhaust. It's not to the point where I'd be concerned yet, just because of the utilization on the CPU. This isn't going to be unique to the flow-through design of this card, because even if you had a card dumping heat through the sides into the case, the radiator is so close that it almost doesn't matter where that exhaust goes as long as it's in the proximity of it. So if you will see combined gaming use at moderate frame rates, which I'd imagine a lot of you are building this just for that purpose, I think the only viable option prior to doing any mods is exhaust, just because you do have a little bit more room for the CPU. You can always run a 280. The GPU is right up against the wall if you run the rad fans as intake. Throwing in the NR200P in its optimal vertical configuration with bottom to top airflow, the fans for the NR200P are running lower because there are 4 of them for the same noise level, but otherwise the Meshlicious GPU temps are fairly comparable, but you do see a pretty large gap for those CPU thermals. I'd anticipate that the best layout when I'm done with some soft mods on this case is going to end up being intake for the rad fans, but if we keep with the exhaust as the optimal setup just for the time being, we can compare against the NR200P. For this test, previously the NR200P was tested with the stock Be Quiet fans, but even with the weaker fans that typically perform at about a 2 or so degree deficit to the NFA 12x25s at this noise level, the NR200P CPU only thermals are still better by a significant margin. With that, let's take a listen to the acoustics at varying fan levels, starting with the minimum 1000 RPM I'd recommend, and topping out at the tested 1550 RPM level. I'm not keen on the fact that these are the only intake or exhaust, but that is one of those concessions in order to get to this 14.7 liter form factor. Although the similar volume N-Case M1 does have more fan options. Now that N-Case is going to be a fairer comparison in terms of volume to the Meshlicious, but the NR200P is more similar in price, and I can only imagine that a lot more of you are choosing between that and the Meshlicious, so I'll frame some of the qualitative points in light of that. So in terms of build and material quality, this one is fairly good. Steel construction, the mesh panels are solid and hefty. The toolless mounts do feel slightly nicer than the Cooler Master ones, but there's not really that much between them. But design-wise, this layout is great. It's really, really easy to get in and out of this case, and the build experience is a bit easier with this one. Cable management is simple, and there's much easier access to the power supply because it's turned to the side. There's not quite as many layout options though with this one. For one, the NR200 does allow a horizontal GPU position, which is far superior, especially combined with the bottom intake fans. And in that scenario, this 3070FE does top out at only 70 degrees or so. The position of the AIO's radiator relative to the pump block does mitigate any concerns for air pocket buildup. In the NR200P with the glass panel, you really do have to choose between a handful of AIOs if you want a bottom mount for optimal performance, but this one works great with most units. Front I/O is adequate. It's different than the NR200 since it does only have one A, but it has one C. And I do really like just having one single A, since the thick USB-A cables twinned onto one header is often a pain to cable manage. And of course the C is a really nice touch and modernized, but these do come at an expense. The C headers are an expense to the manufacturer. The Meshlicious doesn't come with any case fans, and the NR200P does. And yeah, maybe you don't need them with Meshlicious if you're running an AIO, but that is a concession nonetheless. Drive capacity is a bit better for the NR200. It doesn't come with a drive cage to allow you to run a huge stack of SSDs when you're using a small GPU, but you can run a 3.5 HDDs with a lot of NR200P setups and a regular GPU. And at that point, you still have those two SSDs available in the front of the case. Power supply compatibility is about the same in both, now that NR200 has an ATX option. The difference being really that if you do want to go with an ATX supply on this case, you will want that all mesh version. Thermally speaking, the NR200 is superior with more options for air cooling, more options for rad mounting, and the biggest gain from those 3 or so odd liters is those extra 2 case fans with the option to run more depending on what you want to achieve. The end case also allows 2 bottom fans with the GPU along with 2 rad fans on the side, so that is also a very good layout. And realistically, I don't see this case competing with either of those in terms of performance simply because of the fan options. But here's the thing, I really like this case. If you like AIOs, I think you'll love this case. For $110 US in this version, you're getting a lot of features. It's a very unique vertical layout that is a lot of fun to build in. It's visually interesting, it's fun to display and look at. The component placement approach is really novel, and the beauty of this case is that it's not your usual horizontal layout. It's not your typical sandwich layout. Heck, it's not your typical vertical tower with a fire hazard of a riser cable either. It's a thinking outside the box approach to small form factor, a refreshingly different compact case in a league of its own, and I guess you can only call this one sunny side up. So that'll do it for this initial review. I left links down below for the components. Hope you found this information helpful, and thanks for taking an initial look at this case with me. Thumbs up if you liked it. Please subscribe and stay tuned for additional content on this guy, and I will see you again soon.